We call upon the Prime Minister to begin today's debate. Here.
Mr. Speaker, and ladies and gentlemen, we believe the artificial boundaries of sovereignty actually pales in comparison when we compare that with the value of human lives. We say under the current status quo, where there are many problems that are like environmentally induced disasters that are actually threatening the lives and freedom of these individuals, we should impose like harsher measures for the UN Convention to actually impose certain measures for these countries to take them. We believe the fundamental principle behind saving lives applies already to the UN's Convention and already to the principles behind the UN Convention. Race, religion, nationality, membership of social group, and political opinion. If any of these factors actually threaten the freedom or threaten the lives of these individuals, the UN Convention actually allows policies for these individuals to be accepted in another country. And we believe in this case, the environmentally induced disasters, which are actually systematically caused by the developed nations, is actually more like there are more information and more responsibility for these nations to actually take the responsibility in saving them, and will be further elaborated in my arguments. Our policy is going to be very simple. Our policy will be first come, first serve, like any other UN Convention method of taking refugees, and the checking system will also stay the same for these individuals as well. Now let's go on to my substantive arguments. Two things today. I didn't even start. Firstly, why the developed nations are actually responsible for these actions, and secondly, I'm going to tell you why especially is it beneficial for countries, even for countries that accept these refugees in the first place. But before any of these things, I must contextualize what is going on in the world. 5 million people are actually required in disaster assistance in these areas. In Somalia, in Sudan, people are dying because of droughts and excessive mining, deforestation, and the global warming that is systematically induced by these developed nations in the first place. And this, since they bear the responsibility, they should actually do that. And also, the World Health Organization claims that 5.5 million disability-adjusted life years are actually also induced by these disaster industries. And like the harms that are induced from these factors is actually a diminished required water supply, the decreasing fresh water, and crop yields and disasters that actually diminish the capacity of these nations even further sit down. And like since this is the context, let's contextualize why the developed countries are especially responsible for these areas. Well, when we look at the context of the 20th and the 21st century, we see these countries excessively developing their own countries without considering the negative externalities that might affect the entire world in the first place. For instance, the deforestation that takes place in the Amazon and the deforestation that takes place and the excessive mining and excessive use of coal and oil that actually takes place in Haiti has actually induced Haiti to be an area that is prone to these environmentally induced disasters. Hundreds of years ago, Haiti was one of the most developed economies in the world that rely on textile production and whatnot. And since these developed countries actually systematically stripped off the benefits that these countries had in order to develop their own industries. And by the way, don't challenge this. This is by Noam Chomsky. These developing countries actually do have the justification for these developed nations for actually to take these methods in the first place. Since it is caused by the developed nations, since they even take race and religion into taking place, which wasn't actually induced by these developed nations in the first place. They even take these individuals because they value the safety of lives and safety of freedom over that of the artificial sovereignty that exists in this nation. Therefore, we say if it is induced by this nation, it should also be solved by this nation. I'll take closing.
right? So if it's caused by developing nations, we already see attempts to penalize these developed nations more. For example, like this equal but separate policies regarding environmental policies already. Anyway, why do you need to do this?
You know what? Like this double standard argument should be boxed out of any debate. When I have also told you 500 million people are required from disaster assistance, it is like completely absurd for you to say like we do all of these things and why additional things. It's the burden that for you to prove that why 5 million people are living, not dying. And if 5 million people are dying, we don't care if we impose 550 measures. I don't really care. We need this policy in the first place since it is needed and the boundaries of sovereignty should be annihilated when we actually say that lives of people are at stake. And because of that, we don't buy into that idea. And secondly, I'm going to talk about why this can even be beneficial for countries that are accepting, a little later, for countries that are actually accepting these refugees into their areas. Well, obviously, the characterization that comes from Noam Chomsky is very clear, right? These people are actually prone to disasters and prone to death. Since this is the case, there's no way of stopping these people from actually crossing borders. If you do that, these people die. And if you do that, like these people, with the lack of fresh water, it actually induces even more conflicts and even more disasters in the first place. Since like you can't deny that these people will come over to your boundaries and borders anyway, it is impossible. It is possible for you to actually grant these people the travel document in order for them to be assimilated easily into your country until the disaster can be solved in the first place. And if you block that, I believe like that's like satanic. And like since they would assimilate easily, they have to come. There are like two social benefits that would arise. Firstly, they would be highly incentivized to actually work in that area and contribute to what is going on in that area. Yes, actually.
So empirically what we have seen, Mr. Speaker, is that when there was a massive amount of environmental refugees suffering from the situation, they did not go to the United States, they went to Ethiopia. Why is Ethiopia responsible for that action?
They do actually take the Ethiopian, like the Somalian actually went to Kenya and also went to Australia. I don't see like what's the comparison between that. That's the false dichotomy. You're just saying like why are developing countries taking the risk of developed countries? They can take both. Like that's just like simply absurd. And since I have told you like back to my second point about why these countries would be the beneficiaries as well as the benefactors is that they would assimilate easily and firstly they would work since like it is better than the situation that they have stayed in back in the area where they have all these environmentally prone, environmentally induced disasters. And like secondly, they would also be able to be like more amicable to the federal government that is actually like taking these people, which would actually incentivize these people to enhance the relationship between like these countries as well. And since these people are actually prone for the government and voting for the government, it also helps the relationship between these states in the long run and the short run as well. Mr. Speaker, because it is actually induced by these countries, and because we can do more to actually enhance like the conditions not only of these refugees but also the countries that are taking these refugees, we propose this motion.
Okay. Thank you to the Prime Minister. And now we call upon the Leader of Opposition to begin the opposition's case. You're here.
Mr. Speaker, yes, panic and people, oh my God, you're so mean. We get it. This is what you get from the opening government when we have nothing else to say. Vilification of the position given us by the motion. We'll tell you why that taking the opening government side with extensive analysis, why that's demonic and satanic, and to a certain extent also blindsided of what really happens under current situations. As the opening government, we would like to, first of all, tell you that yes, environmental refugees might happen, but the characteristics of environmental refugees are starkly different from the other refugees that we see today. Refugees of political situations or religious prosecution are mostly, first of all, smaller in number and also supposed to be, at least under principle, a temporary phenomenon. You can go back to your country once that situation is over. The problem with environmental refugees that certain whole regions, agricultural or environmental infrastructure is destroyed, and you leave it alone that way, you have millions of people coming in, not thousands, not hundreds, you have millions of people, please sit down. And furthermore, they're here to stay. They're not going to go back. So the contextualization of refugees and what we have first started off as the deal is totally different from the characterization we're trying to talk about. Please sit down. We have a different approach. We don't think that environmental refugee situations of desertification or destruction is going to happen tomorrow, and therefore it's an urgent situation. It is an urgent situation that we need to address it. We need to recognize that as a problem. That you're not going to die tomorrow just because we didn't let you move over. We think that the current existing UN programs, such as the UN Convention on Battling Desertification, the UNEP, the UN Clean Development Mechanisms, and all these other mechanisms from the developed countries are already actively doing these measures to combat and prevent these matters from happening. If you look at, for instance, even in countries like China, where the yellow dust problem was serious, we had Japan and Korea actively going there and planting trees there. We think that the process is not imminent, therefore we don't have to take drastic measures on the issue. So please sit down, sir. We have a problem if we actually go against the current status quo, and this is the reasons why. Number one, Mr. Speaker, they said that we have a responsibility to develop countries. Here's the problem. Most of these countries that suffer from environmental situations are also adjacent to poor, dirt-poor countries. So when you say that they're so tired, and how the hell are you going to go from Ethiopia to Australia? You're going to swim? We think that the situation, for instance, in the cases of Dadaab, you have 1.2 million of your 5 million refugees in one area in Ethiopia and bordering on Somalia. We don't think Ethiopia is a developed country. We don't think Ethiopia has the capacity to have 1.2 billion people. Number two, this will be awesome and dandy, because you know why? Because, well, we'll have a nice workforce. First of all, most of these people are primitive farmers. We don't really think that they have the capacity. Number two, if you need a workforce, we already have existing systems within sovereignty to check and balance for those mutual needs. This is not a way to get your new peasants into your country and start African farming mechanisms. Finally, we have this other issue. Noam Chomsky, my ass, that example was about economic destruction. How the hell did economic exploitation cause IT to get hit by an earthquake? We really don't think Walmart has the capacity to do that, although they have a lot of stock market value. Yes?
Well, if that is caused ourselves, and if they cannot go back to their countries, isn't it better way when you deal with that problem?
No. Here's the problem. First of all, if you do this, these people have no incentive to go back to their country. These countries that have been destroyed environmentally become no man's land. There is no incentive for the international society to work to combat desertification. All you're doing is crumbling these people into better society. But we'll go to that in the arguments. The final aspect that we'd like to talk about. Deforestation, excessive mining, this mostly happens because of the people there. The developing countries such as Borneo or Brazil does this too. So we think that this small tidbit, go. Now, we'll talk about our arguments. First of all, we would like to talk about how this is an unfair burden to host countries, which have characterized they're not always necessarily the developed countries. Second, there's a clear no standard. This will be used as an abusive mechanism. I'll yield the floor to my second speaker, which will talk about how this also weakened the international standing of refugee status as a whole. First argument, as we talked about, Dadaab, 1.2 million people went to Ethiopia. Not to Europe, not to America, Ethiopia. This is a poor country of its own, which also suffers its own problems of supporting its own people. It also has problems of crops and water, and now you have also the equal responsibility to take care of other people as well. We believe it's nice and dandy that you save a lot of people, but we also think that a sovereign nation's first priority is to take care of your own people first. When there is a current situation where it's not a huge influx of people that are impoverished and have no jobs and just simply came in there and squatted and demand for you to provide their scarce resources where even they cannot provide to their own people, and force this through a UN resolution to these countries that initially registered this for political reasons, for stabilizing these kind of regions for religious and political tension, and suddenly pushing them from thousands of people into millions of people, from people that we can shelter into people that are robbing our own people's scarce resources. That is a gross violation of these own countries. Another thing, we talk about adjacency. If you have Southeast Asian countries which are actually prone to these environmental dangers, you're not going to have people swimming 50 to 80 miles to Australia or to South Korea. You're probably going to go to the next most imminent place where you're not going to die. This also causes where, therefore, you're pushing the burden of poor countries to poor countries. Also, because the situation is solved, the imminent case of people immediately dying or whatever, at least the perception is gone. The international community has no incentive to try to fix this problem. You leave them alone, and then matters solved. Finally, we also have a question of this. If this is the case, because refugees, by its nature, you do not require some screening process, it's not like that. You come in, and we need to accept you. Here's a problem at the current situation to a certain extent. If you have millions of people saying that my farmland is no more, I have no crops, so I'm here. I have a right to stay here. You have no screening process. How are you going to stop this from people abusing the system? You do not have border control. You cannot have population control. You have unwanted, impoverished, sick, disease-ridden, poverty-famished farmers coming into your region. Now that's nice if you have the capacity to accept them, but you have 1.2 million in Ethiopia. If you have people in Gabon, if you have people in Zaire coming into this, these people have to take the brunt of that. And these countries that can't take care of their own people will abuse this. The governments will push these people that they don't want in these environmental regions that they have to solve and just push them to their neighbors. And they have no choice because of international law. We think this is a problem, and you need to accept the fact it's not really more about Noam Chomsky or us being satanic, but more about having a deeper thinking capacity and analysis of the real picture at hand. Thank you.
Thank you to the leader, and now for the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the government.
You know what? I think like really weird POI. We need to do different way. There is a we don't need it. You know, because your measure is not working right now. There is why 5.5 million people died right now. There is why we need to accept them. If you are different measures and alternatives working in a great way, they don't have to come. That is the status quo. Even if I'm giving you a lot of water and money, but their life is in threat, they can come. That is the status quo. That is why your alternative argument, which is not mutually exclusive, you can do both. But people is dying, we must accept them because this is our problems rather than their problems. With that, I have 3 questions in today's debate. First, the big ideas, responsibility of developing nations. You know, everybody knows because we put too much oil in our car, you know, we use too much resources, Earth is dying. That affect the poor nations. You know, you can't deny that ideas. Second idea is about the line coming from Jeesoo. This is abuse, right? There is no screening policy. I know there is a screening policy. There is the island called the Christmas Island in Australia, you know. There is a screened out people which lie at the first place. Last idea, why developed nations now have more motivation to solve the problems of, you know, the environmental problems of developing nations. No. The first idea is developing nation responsibility, right? We said there's a pool and a lot of responsibility. So the only response coming from Jeesoo is this, you know. They do themselves, they cut down their trees, getting a lot of resources from their own land. That is why people died. But the problem is the developed nations use and abuse this systematic government of developing nations, right? There's a lot of dictators. They just go there, I'm going to give you more, no, left, don't left, this is true, right? I give you more money, that is why I want to cut you a lot of trees. That is why people is a lot of dying. Then he said, people is going to the Ethiopia. That's true. You know why? Because that is the only country who accept the environment. Australia say, I accept these guys come. You know, he said, they can't swim. But the problem is, Australia in the middle of the sea, the small land, is the countries who get most numbered refugees. Which means even if it's really hard, even if it's really difficult, they come to Australia to save their own life. That is why you can't lie. Nobody can go there places, right? Thirdly and finally, even if Ethiopia is the only country to accept these people, they are under the UN conventions, right? If there's a political reasons or like freedom reasons, they must accept because, and then we want to put one more standard of that conventions, right? Then he said, they can't go back to their countries. That is why we shouldn't do this. Yes, that is why we need to deal with these people more. Right? Because they cannot come back. If there's a problem with freedom, they can come back. If the problem solved, they can come back, you know, like other regions of refugees. But the problems of environmental refugees, which is caused by developed nations, they can come back. That is why we need these guys more. Like I said before, like Afghanistan, both peoples go to the Australia a lot. That is why you can lie into this thing. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Ethiopia is not accepting any environmental refugees. They're basically kicking them out and killing them.
No, it's not true. Somalia have it's not true. According to economists, many economists right now, right? There's refugees only for the environmental refugees, right? Over that book, I researched a lot of computers, that's why I know, right? They go to Ethiopia, they have a 90,000 capacity, but there's 3 times more people living there. Why? Other developed nations cannot take these people. We think that is the problem. Second idea, there is no screening process. I think this argument is for about no accepting any refugees, right? All the refugees has a possibility of use themselves. But the problem is, we just put the one more standard. They must wait in the Christmas Island, if this is the case of Australia, they will have the same screening process. They will take same ideas with Australian government. I think this is better than others. Why? Because my first speaker clearly said no response whatsoever. These people is going to come to the Australia anyway. Why? Because their life is free. Those people come to the Australia in the illegal way. You subsidizing illegal, human trafficking because you giving them a more product and consuming people to come to my land. But under our policy, we can make them more productive. People is going to accept them more. That is why our policy is way more than your policy. And like I said before, if you want to do other measures, do it and go ahead, but to do it in the right way, then people is not going to come to Australia anyway. Last idea is why you have a motivation to deal with the problems more. I think this is really big, and this is a really important argument in today's debate. They say people cannot come. They say if you accept these people, those people doesn't have any motivations to make their countries better. But the problem is, this is the first dichotomy. Their people cannot make their country better, right? The people who can make their country better is the developed nations, people who is living in my countries. Then why this policy make them more motivated at solving the problems and environmental issue? Because they can see these people more, right? They can humanize these people more. If I have these people in my neighborhood, I ask these people, why do you come to my Korea? Why do you come to my countries? Because my country's situation is really bad. Because you use a lot of oil and gases, because my country is really bad. That is why they can push their government more. This is different is just seeing the BBC. We always see the BBC and people is dying in Africa, but we never donate the money, right? I know you guys do that. Rich don't want to pay the money. But people who went to Africa having a volunteer work, they tend to pay more money. Why? Because they humanize these people. These people is not just only like people who see from the TV. We listen more from these people, right? We can recognize more problems of that countries. And second idea, if like these guys say these people is spreading the disease, why? It's fucking yes. But the problem is, if you hate it, you can push your government more. I don't want to see environmental refugees in my countries. That is why I fix the problems. I don't want to see them anymore. A lot of my neighbors, I can't talk with anymore. I don't think this is right and nice thing to do, like these guys do. But these people can push their government using their voting power, solve the problems at the first place. Mr. Speaker, you can't accept the fact, opening opposition lying about the debate, right? We don't accept these people. Most of the environment problem is caused by developing nations. Our government push the dictators, I want to cut down more trees. Our government push the dictators, I want to get more resources from your cave. That's why they tend to, easily get the flood, and there's a lot of environmental problem. That is why this is my problem, this is your responsibility, it's all our responsibility. If you deny these people, you can't go home and take a rest, sleep, and having a nice life. I think that's a bad idea. You must say, these are my responsibility, that is why we need to accept them. For those reasons, I'm very proud to propose this.
Thank you to the Deputy Prime Minister, and now for the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Namchul Kim was usually better than this in past tournaments, but today he certainly engaged with a strategy that I would not have done on proposition, and that was to concede that people in developed countries will certainly hate that environmental refugee because it's certainly harmful for that society once you start to accept those refugees. That was a major concession to our principle that this is an unfair burden to those countries to host countries, Mr. Speaker. I have 7 points of refutation before I move on to my substantive material as to why this weakens the international standing and further devastates the problem solution to this instance. So I have 3 points in 3 issues in refutation. Firstly, regarding the first argument, whether or not developed countries should be responsible for these kind of atrocities happening in the developing nations. Like, I have 3 responses. Firstly, in our POI, we pointed out that was a false characterization of the status quo because most of the environmental refugees go to other underdeveloped nations like Ethiopia. When there was desertification refugees going in Africa, then most of them, 1.2 million, went to Ethiopia, not Australia, Mr. Speaker, precisely because of regional proximity. That these people, it's easier for to go to Ethiopia rather than Australia. They then said it's because Australia does not allow those environmental refugees. Well, that's the same with Ethiopia, Mr. Speaker. They don't allow environmental refugees. That was just a fact inadequacy in their case. Second point of refutation, like they then said, those harms and those environmental problems are all caused of developed countries. And we thought also this was a wrong characterization because most of the environmental refugees come from desertification, which is the fault of the developing nations actually. Like mining and overgrazing, overfarming, and those instances are the fault of developing countries. So it's wrong for you to solely blame developed countries for that matter. They then said that developed countries are systematically abusing developing countries' economic infrastructure. Well, if that's the root cause of the problem, try to fix that with international law, Mr. Speaker. Third point of refutation, we say that already in our POIs and rebuttals to their material. We told you that the core problems should be solved through international mechanisms like CDM, Clean Development Mechanism in the United Nations, like UNCC, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, Mr. Speaker. We think these are going on and reinforcing those mechanisms will solve the core problem. They then said it's not mutually exclusive. Well, it's mutually exclusive because once you force these countries to sign a contract that they have not agreed on, they will lose incentives to do other mechanisms and do other solutions. And that is the stance why their first argument about the responsibility does not stand in this way. Second argument regarding the benefits, this Sarahas said that it's beneficial for host countries for 2 reasons. Firstly, they can work there. Secondly, it makes good diplomatic relations. Both of them are ridiculous. Firstly, even if they work there, they're primitive African farmers, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that this will contribute a lot to the economy. But moreover, Mr. Speaker, if you want more workforce in country, we have plenty of unemployed people in developed nations in the status quo. 48% of youth unemployment rate is rampant in Greece and Portugal, Mr. Speaker. We think workforce does not stand in this way. But secondly, diplomatic relations. We think this is hilarious. Why is that? Because those countries, developing countries, where they will have the flight in their population going to other countries because you allow it, will hate that policy because they lose their citizens, they lose their population residing in that country. So it worsens diplomatic relations. The third thing was regarding Namchul Young's policy and Namchul Young's argument about the awareness. I have 2 responses. Firstly, as I pointed out in my introduction, it was a major concession that those countries are having unfair burden and therefore hate it, Mr. Speaker. But secondly, we say that those citizens in those developed countries will not increase awareness and therefore push the government to enforce such policies. That was ridiculous. Why? Because it actually increases social conflict and tension. I wouldn't want to see 2 million African people residing in Korea because of environmental refugees and sucking out our social welfare system, not paying back to that and contributing back to the economy. We think this is unfair burden. Therefore, their concession was that they hated and therefore they should not impose unfair burden. So having all those established rebuttals, I'm going to move on to my substantive material as to why it weakens the international standing. But before that, rebut it.
Please respond to the idea, why are you accepting refugees in the first place then? Since all of your arguments are based on the assumption...
Alright, I get it. Mr. Speaker, in our first argument, we clearly gave you the different characteristics of other religious political refugees and environmental refugees. Because first difference was that they came in huge amounts simultaneously, and the second difference is that they reside in there permanently, despite other forms of refugees, like political refugees or religious refugees, they reside temporarily, Mr. Speaker. Those are the 2 differences that we presented to you as to why there's a difference between other forms of refugees and environmental refugees. But moreover, they have not rebutted to our second point of argument, Mr. Speaker, regarding the lack of standard. Therefore, why can be abused, Mr. Speaker? We told you that global warming is not a radical thing. It's not an imminent threat posed upon you. It's not like I slept one day, next day when I woke up, 5 meters of sea level has risen. It's not like that. Desertification, it's not like there was a forest here, next day, forest became desert. It's not like that. It's a slower procedure and an eventual procedure, gradual procedure that we can solve by solving core of the problem itself, Mr. Speaker. Because the gradual procedure of such causes of environmental refugees, we think that this policy can be abused largely. Because even if you don't think that, like the desertification is that serious, that threatens your life, Mr. Speaker, if you just want to live in Switzerland because you think that the social welfare system there is cool, you might just apply for that, right? Because it's better for you to do that and leave your country and go to developed countries with better developed social welfare and suck that social welfare system out. That was the abuse and the lack of standards that we pointed to in our second argument, which these guys failed to respond. So finally, in our argument, I'm going to tell you why international standing will be further weakened toward other refugees and other solutions that we are currently reinforcing under the status quo. Like we say, it's kind of like funny that in our fifth round in prelims that they were the ones who said that international laws lack enforcement mechanism and binding power. Therefore, it is crucial that you have consent in that international binding power. If you can see that those countries will hate it, obviously they will not consent to the extension of such mechanisms. So the probable and the most likely outcome is that they don't agree to the enforcement mechanism and they don't have binding power because you don't have consent. One, you simply ignore the decision of the United Nations from then on, right? Because you don't agree. Australian people under the status quo are not accepting people from South Pacific Islands. We don't think that will change because you changed that policy. But secondly, and more problematically, they start to opt out of that policy in general. That is dangerous because, first of all, you weaken the international standing of the United Nations in general because those people are explicitly ignoring what United Nations is trying to make them do. But secondly, this opt-out is dangerous because you also endanger other forms of refugees who are unfairly penalized by this policy. Because other forms of refugees are not permanent residents, are in small number. Therefore, these developed countries were originally willing to take those refugees. Now they're not because they opt out because of the extension. Because we proved to you on principle level and practical level, this policy stands for absolute devastation of international relations. I'm fundamentally proud to oppose.